I'll still get to that, so I'll still explain that. I just saw through the informals that we submitted now that some students are still struggling with how to subtract items from or to extract a certain percentage out of something which is something that already has a percentage added to it. So I just thought it good to also just do this little example that I did in the class before. It doesn't really matter. This does apply for P's and G's and for VAT. The percentage doesn't really matter. But yeah, you can just have a look. I'm just going to run through this and play around with it. I think that's the biggest thing, is for you to play around with it. So the main thing, as I explained in that lecture, was that whenever you have a amount and you add 15% like VAT or P's and G's of 10% to this, you end up with a 15% or a 10% here, which is then added to your original amount. So your original amount is the original amount plus the 15%, and thus if you times this with 15%, you end up with 15% plus your original amount that you times it with. So you're not ending up with only the 15%. This item this already includes 15%, so if you times it with 15% again, you including this little 15% already in the calculation. So let me just go to the next slide. On this slide you will see how it's explained. It shows it a little bit better. If you have your original amount and you add 15% by just adding the 100% here, it just gives you a bit of a sense of how it works. So instead of just using the 15%, you just put it over 100, which is 15%. Okay, so you end up with your 15% on this side. Now what that means is if you add that to your original amount, you have 115 over 100 because you've added the 15 to your original amount. Okay, so if you want to take this out, you have to times it with 15 over 115, because this now includes 115, to get your 15% here again, and vice versa. If you want to get your 100% out of this, you just times it with 100 over 115. Okay, so I hope it explains it. I don't want to try and explain it more. Usually I end up making it more confusing than it already is. So just play around with this. Add the 100, or rather use the 15 over 100, and then play around with it to make sure that you understand how it works. Okay, cool. So let's get into Appendix 2, and you will see we're going to look at the story enclosure method. So yeah, that's explained in the next slides. Okay, I want you to go to your annexure or Appendix 2 and your example 2. So you'll see this is exactly as we've got it in the study notes, so I'll be almost just reading it from the text. So please just follow me as I go through, but please make sure that you have your example 1A in front of you when we go through the study material. Okay, so for the purpose of this example, is to illustrate the concept of the story enclosure method. So we look at our building. As you can see, it's obviously been designed by QS again. It is a exciting square rectangle building, 9 by 9 meters on square on plan, and it has an elevation of 2.4 meters. The example 2 of the area method shows that the design detail determines the area tariff. Okay, so by using the historical area tariff, a new estimate can only be correct if the design detail of the planned work is the same for the historical project. Okay, this is never the case. So to overcome the problem, the story enclosure method calculates the basic building cost by measuring each story enclosure element and pricing each at its own unit tariff. The quantity of each story enclosure element that varies from building to building is thus taken into account in the estimate. Okay, so for the purpose of this example, assume that the unit rates of the four-story enclosure elements, i.e. the rates in its own plane, are as follows. So this is the historical data of of the building. So we've got the surface bed, which is 100 Rand per square meter. We've got the roof area, which is 150 Rand per square meter, and we've got the exterior walls, which is 400 Rand per square meter. And then we've got the exterior walls or the interior walls, which is 200 Rand per square meter. Okay, so thus the average unit rate of an element is the cost of the element itself plus the standard finishes on both sides. Okay, so what that basically means is that the finishes are included in the rates above. Okay, looking at our next section, for the exterior of 220 millimeter walls, the unit rate is 400 Rand per square meter, includes the cost of brickwork, exterior doors and windows, and the standard plaster and paint finishes. The surface bed rate is 100 Rand per square meter, and it includes the surface bed with the surface finishes on top, screed plus vinyl tiles, etc. But also all the foundation costs below the surface bed. The moisture barrier, hardcore filling, foundations and the foundation walls are thus considered as the standard finishes below the surface bed element. Okay. For the 9x9 square meter or the 9x9 meter building under investigation, the bill of quantities, which I will not actually say is bill of quantities, but it is more a schedule of quantities, are as follows. Okay, so we've got a surface bed, which is 9x9, which amounts to 81 square meters, and we've got a rate of 100 square meters, which we get from our previous slide, and we times that to get a amount of 8,100 for our surface beds. Then we move to our roof, so we calculate that. It's also 9x9, so we get our 81 square meters, and we've got a rate of 150 Rand per square meter for that, and thus we times that out to get to our 12,150. Our exterior walls, we calculate the square meter of that. It is basically the 9x9 calculated to times a height of 2.4 to actually get the square meter rate, and thus we use the 400 Rand per square meter to calculate that and to get our area. And thus we're just left with our interior walls, so which we calculate at 43.2 square meters times our rate of 200 Rand per square meter. We thus just add all our elements and to get our total construction cost of 63,450 Rand. Okay, note that the unit measure for each of the story enclosure elements is square meter. The total estimated estimate for the basic building cost is thus 63,450 as mentioned. So the unit rate of an element can thus be expressed as a factor times a constant rate of say 400 square meters without changing the elements as follows. So the 400 that they got was basically taking a factor if the exterior walls has a factor of 1, and its given rate was 400, then one can calculate what the factors should be for the other elements to actually get to the rates that we need. So the first thing is you can refer to your page 13 of part 2 of your study notes, just for a bit of an explanation of how they got to the 400 Rand and a factor of 1. But don't worry too much about that. That will be given usually in the questions. Okay, so what they then did further was, if you know that the square meter rate is 400 Rand per square meter for a factor of 1, one can easily work it back and calculate that if you divide 8,100 by 400, you get a factor of 2.5. So thus they worked it back in this example and actually showed that one could actually get to the same answer by timesing it with the factor. And this factor is the factor that we spoke of last week in the theoretical class. Okay, the actual unit rate of a story enclosure element can thus be obtained by multiplying the constant rate of 400 square meters with the factor. This constant rate, 400 square meter or 400 Rand per square meter, is called the story enclosure tariff, as spoken about last week. The set is published by the Bureau of Economic Research in Stellenbosch and depends on the inflation of the construction industry. Okay, the story enclosure factors adjust the set up or down to obtain the actual rate for the particular element in its own plane. For example, to obtain the true rate of 100 Rand per square meter for the surface bed, a factor of 0.25 is used and times with the set, which was given as 400 Rand per square meter. Thus, instead of multiplying the factor with the set, one can rather adjust the measured quantity of the element with the factor as follows. So it's the same table again. So we've got our areas that we've worked out in our first example, and we've got our factors. So what we just do is, instead of multiplying the factors with our rates, we just calculated or multiplied with our areas, and thus we get a total area of 158 square meters if we add the 20.25, the 30.37 and the 80.4 and the 21.6 to get a factor of 158 square meters. This can then be multiplied with the 400 and you still get the same answer as before. Okay, so each story enclosure element is measured to obtain its physical area. The area is multiplied with the factor applicable to the element, and thus you get the story enclosure area, and this is what we spoke of last week in our study notes. And the total story enclosure area in this case was 158 square meters for the building, and this is multiplied with the rate of 400 Rand per square meter as given on the question, and we obtain the same amount as we did with the previous two examples. The values of the actual factor to be used in practice is thus represented by the following formula. You have your actual historical data rate of the element, okay, and then you divide it by your historical cost or your historical enclosure tariff. Okay. This was shown in the example above. Okay, the unit rate of a story enclosure element increased due to the inflation. In a similar way, the published set also increases due to inflation. the result is that the values of the factor for the story enclosure elements of a particular building remain fairly the same with time. You can also refer to paragraph 1.11.1 of your chapter D. This is what we discussed last week, which I've been referring to during these examples. Thus, just final note is that note that the factors used for the surface bed and the roof in this example is far from practically correct. It's only correct in the sense that it explains the concept of the story enclosure method. Okay, thank you guys for listening to this video. If you do have any questions, you know where to find me, and yeah, please send through any questions if there is.